The oak-paneled study smelled like money and judgment. Golden light slanted through tall windows, dusting the shelves of leather-bound books and the oil portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch us with narrowed eyes. I sat at the far end of the long polished table, in my soft cardigan and worn jeans, the only person in the room who looked out of place. At 28, I had chosen work that didn't come with power suits or stock portfolios. Running a nonprofit paid me enough to keep my independence, but in this family, it marked me as a disappointment. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard, with his silver hair and the habit of clearing his throat before every decree. He had built a reputation as the family's iron voice, and tonight he wore it like a uniform. Beside him, my mother, Margaret Maggie, to everyone outside the family, sat straight-backed, rings glittering, her eyes sharp enough to slice. She rarely spoke without finality. To Richard's right, my brother David leaned back in his custom-tailored suit, the air of someone fresh from a deal in New York still clinging to him. He thrived on the performance of success, the watch glinting at his wrist worth more than my yearly salary. Across from him, my sister Linda adjusted the strap of her designer handbag and checked her phone as if the family meeting were cutting into more glamorous plans. I folded my hands in my lap, the only sound in the room the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. I wondered not for the first time why they had summoned me here like this. It felt less like a family gathering and more like standing trial. The portraits on the walls whispered of heritage and wealth, but I could hear something else in the silence, something pressing down on me. My father, Richard, cleared his throat the way he always did when preparing to speak with authority. The sound echoed through the room like the gavel of a judge about to pronounce sentence. "Before we begin," he said, folding his hands on the gleaming oak table, "I want it understood that this meeting is about discipline and securing our family's future. What we decide tonight will shape generations." His words carried the weight of legacy, but also a rehearsed quality, as though he had already decided the outcome. Margaret nodded beside him, sliding a neat stack of papers forward. "We've been reviewing the numbers," she said. "Our family's yearly support costs have grown unmanageable. Change is overdue." Her eyes shifted toward me with a deliberate pause. "We can't continue as we have." David leaned in, his cufflinks flashing. "The figures speak for themselves," he said, his voice smooth with the assurance of someone who had spent too long in boardrooms. "Our family aid has ballooned in recent years. Accountability has to be introduced, especially for those who haven't shown appreciation." His smile was courteous, but the words were anything but. Linda followed quickly, her tone clipped. "Some people," she said, glancing at me with practiced disdain, "need to take responsibility. It's not healthy for them to keep depending on others." I kept my gaze steady on the grain of the table, forcing myself not to react. I knew my nonprofit salary looked modest compared to their lifestyles, and I knew exactly whom they were targeting. Their message was clear. I was the dependent child. I was the liability. Richard adjusted his glasses and pressed on. "The emergency fund has been drained too often. Rent, repairs, endless requests. This reliance has to stop. It's no way to build a future." Then Margaret delivered the line she had saved, her voice sharp with certainty. "We're not your bank anymore." She let it hang in the air, final and cutting. The words should have wounded me, but instead they settled like a key turning in a lock. My heart thudded once, then steadied. They thought they were closing a door. They didn't know the door had been in my hands all along. I glanced at each of them. Richard, stone-faced in his authority. Margaret, sure of her righteousness. David, brimming with smug certainty. Linda, already impatient to be elsewhere. Their verdict was pronounced. I was to stand on my own. Without their money, without their aid. Margaret's words were still hanging in the air when my phone, face down beside my plate, gave the faintest vibration. I slid my hand over it, more to steady myself than to check. But the notification glowed up at me like a private signal. Whitman Trust Management. The message was concise, businesslike. But the names leapt out: David Thompson, $15,000 monthly allowance. Linda Thompson, $12,000. Margaret Thompson, $8,000. Richard Thompson, $18,000. Approval required by 5:00 p.m. I stared at the screen as their voices carried on around me, discussing how I needed to grow up and take responsibility. They spoke with the certainty of people convinced they were rescuing me from myself. None of them suspected that the same allowances funding their suits, handbags, and dinner reservations now pulsed on my phone, waiting for my approval. I felt the edges of a smile touch my lips, quickly masked as I reached for my water glass. My pulse was steady, almost calm. I thought of every lecture I'd sat through, every sideways glance at family gatherings, every moment my work in the nonprofit world was dismissed as naive. Their judgments had been rehearsed so many times that tonight felt like nothing new. But the irony, the irony was almost unbearable. I lowered my gaze, shielded by the rim of my glass, and pressed my thumb to the screen. One by one, each request disappeared under a single word. Denied. The air around the table remained unchanged. Richard still explaining the virtue of independence. David adjusting his cuff. Linda checking her nails. They didn't feel the tremor that had just passed through the structure of their comfortable lives. But I did. And I knew what was coming would not just crack their confidence, it would collapse it. The steady rhythm of my heart was the only sound I could hear until the door to the study swung open. All heads turned. A woman stepped inside, polished in a dark suit, her leather briefcase balanced against one arm. She carried herself with the ease of someone used to entering rooms like this, though she gave a polite nod as if aware of interrupting. "Apologies," she said smoothly, "but I need a moment of Miss Thompson's time." Richard was already rising from his chair, his voice layered with authority. "You can hand those documents to me? I manage all trust matters for this family." The woman blinked in genuine surprise, then shook her head. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Thompson, these are for your daughter, Sarah." She shifted her briefcase, extracting a folder of embossed papers, and set them on the table in front of me. The silence that followed had weight. Richard froze halfway out of his seat, his hand gripping the back of his chair. David's practiced smile faltered. While Linda's phone lowered slowly from her hand, Margaret was the first to speak, her voice thin. "What exactly do you mean?" The woman introduced herself as Patricia Williams, trust officer with Whitman Trust Management. Her tone was professional, unwavering. "Miss Thompson has been the primary trustee of the Thompson Family Trust since her 25th birthday. She holds full discretionary authority over distributions and investments, as outlined by the late Mr. Thompson's directives." Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. Patricia slid the signed certification across the table for emphasis. "Your father established clear conditions. The successor trustee must demonstrate fiduciary training and a commitment to charitable stewardship. Miss Thompson met both criteria 3 years ago, and she has overseen the trust successfully since." The room seemed to tilt under the weight of her words. I could see the disbelief traveling from face to face, a ripple of confusion laced with fear. David leaned forward as if trying to argue with the paper itself. Linda whispered, "That can't be real," though her voice betrayed uncertainty. I touched the folder lightly, not to flaunt it, but to ground myself. For years they had dismissed my choices, belittled my path, and now, with one door opening and a handful of documents on the table, the ground beneath them shifted for good. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, marking each second of disbelief. Richard was the first to break. His hand, still clutching the chair back, trembled as he reached for the papers. He scanned the lines, his lips moving silently, until finally he muttered, "Impossible." I've managed this family's finances for 30 years. His voice was meant to sound commanding, but it carried a new tremor, one I had never heard before. Margaret leaned closer to him, her posture rigid though her eyes darted nervously. "This must be some mistake," she said quickly, and then almost too fast added, "We only wanted to guide you. Sarah, you know that. Everything we said was to help you grow." Her words tried to reshape what had just happened, but they fell thin, lacking the sharp edge of certainty she usually carried. For the first time, her authority cracked. David, unwilling to sit in silence, let out a strained laugh. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice wavered. His phone lit up just then, a client's name flashing across the screen. He answered on reflex, switching to the slick tone he used in business only for the speakerphone to betray him. "David, your reimbursement still hasn't cleared. We can't move forward without payment." The line went dead. David's jaw tightened as every eye in the room bore down on him. The mask of effortless success he had polished for years fractured in a single call. Across the table! Linda's hand shook as she refreshed her banking app. A faint gasp escaped her. "Declined. That can't be right." Another ding, a message from her spa appointment canceled due to payment issues. She dropped the phone into her lap as if it had stung her. Her carefully composed glamour wavered, the shine peeling away to reveal panic underneath. Richard shoved the papers back toward Patricia with a shaking hand. "Even if this is legitimate, I built this wealth. I deserve control." His words rang hollow, as if he were trying to summon a past that no longer existed. The truth was there in black and white, and even the portraits on the walls seemed to watch him with silent reproach. I sat quietly, letting the silence do what my words could not. Every judgment they had placed on me, every dismissal, every look of superiority now turned inward. The cracks were no longer subtle. They were breaking, one by one, right in front of me. Patricia remained composed, her hands folded neatly over the folder as if she had given this explanation 100 times before. "The Thompson Family Trust," she said evenly, "is structured to provide for estate taxes, household staff, property maintenance, and monthly distributions to beneficiaries. Miss Thompson has reviewed and authorized all such payments for the past 3 years. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Richard's shoulders stiffened, his eyes narrowing as though he could will the truth away. Margaret's face drained of color, her practiced composure thinning. David shifted in his chair, restless, while Linda's fingers tapped nervously against her phone, though she no longer dared look at it. I let the silence stretch before I spoke. "Every allowance you've received, every bill paid, every property kept afloat, it all passed through me. The help you believed I needed was, in fact, the help I was providing." My voice stayed calm, though inside I felt the faint burn of years of humiliation finally given shape. Richard tried to answer, but no words came. Margaret's mouth opened and closed, a reflex without sound. The portraits on the walls, ancestors immortalized in oil, seemed almost to lean closer, as if witnessing a reckoning they had long expected. For years I had been the family outlier, tolerated more than respected, humored but never trusted, and yet, in the quiet hours they never saw, I had signed the documents, balanced the accounts, and kept this estate from crumbling. The irony hung in the air, thick enough to taste. I drew a slow breath, steadying myself as every pair of eyes turned toward me. For the first time in years, no one interrupted. Their silence gave me room to do what they had always done to me, lay down terms. "The allowances," I began, my tone deliberate, "are paused effective immediately. No automatic transfers will be made until I see documented budgets." The words felt clinical, but necessary. I reached for the folder Patricia had set down, flipping to the summary sheet. "From this point forward, distributions will be capped." Richard's jaw tightened, but I continued. "Richard, $12,000 a month. subject to expense reporting. Margaret, $6,000, with oversight on discretionary spending. David and Linda, you'll each receive $8,000, pending quarterly reviews. I let the figures sink in before adding. And yes, counseling. Every beneficiary will attend financial counseling sessions. That is non-negotiable. The silence broke into fragments of protest. David was first, his voice sharp. That won't cover my operating costs. You're cutting into business relationships, into client entertainment. You can't possibly expect me to function on scraps. I met his glare without flinching. You told me to live within my means. I suggest you practice the same. Linda's voice cracked. You're treating us like children. I have commitments, appointments, memberships. She faltered. The reality of those canceled notifications still raw. No, I corrected softly. I'm treating you like adults who need to manage income responsibly. Margaret's hand twitched against the table, the diamond on her finger catching the light. This is humiliating, she whispered, more to herself than to me. Accountability always feels that way at first, I answered, my tone even. Richard finally found his voice, rough with suppressed fury. You are dismantling what I built. This family has always stood above such restrictions. I leaned forward slightly, closing the space between us. You didn't build it. Dad. Grandfather did, and he made sure it would only endure if managed wisely. He trusted me to do what none of you imagined I could. The words hung heavy, undeniable. The walls of the study seemed to absorb them, the clock marking each second of their new reality. For the first time since the meeting began, Margaret's sharp composure wavered. She reached across the table, her manicured hand brushing my sleeve, the gesture strangely fragile against all the steel she had shown before. Sarah, she said softly, we didn't know. We thought. We only wanted the best for you. Her eyes, usually hard with certainty, looked unsettled, searching for a thread of forgiveness. The touch startled me more than her words. How many times in my life had I wanted my mother to reach for me like this, a dozen, 100, always, in moments when I had been dismissed, when silence had cut deeper than any scolding. And yet, here it was arriving not as comfort, but as defense. I held still, letting her hand rest for a moment before I drew back. You wanted me to learn independence? I said evenly. Tonight, you see what it looks like. Her face crumpled at the edges, though she tried to hold her dignity intact. Richard looked away, unwilling to witness her falter. David shifted uncomfortably, as though family emotion had no place in a boardroom setting. Linda's eyes brimmed, though whether with guilt or fear I couldn't tell. I wished, in some buried part of me, that this had been a moment of real reconciliation, that her words carried the weight of truth, but I knew my mother too well. Apologies came quickly when control slipped, not when love deepened. I straightened the folder before me, feeling the room wait for me to soften, to relent. Instead, I turned another page and spoke with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in silence for years. There will be one more change. David groaned audibly. Linda shook her head, and Richard's eyes narrowed, bracing for another cut. Margaret whispered my name as if pleading could rewind what had already been said. The trust allows for charitable discretion, I continued. Grandfather made sure of it. Effective immediately. $5 million will be allocated to establish a foundation, one focused on the causes I've devoted my career to. Housing, education, and health for families who live with less than we ever imagined. The words struck them harder than any allowance reduction. David leaned forward, his voice raised. You can't just give away our inheritance. It was never yours, I replied steadily. It was grandfather's. He left it to the family, under the stewardship of the trustee. That's me. Linda's face twisted, panic and disbelief mingling. You'd rather hand our money to strangers than to your own blood. I didn't look away. The strangers you dismiss are the very people grandfather intended to help through me. My nonprofit work wasn't a mistake. It was preparation. Richard pounded the table once, but the sound felt more desperate than powerful. This is a betrayal. No, I said quietly. It's a fulfillment. A portion of this wealth will finally carry meaning beyond handbags and dinners, beyond titles and appearances. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match could have been. Margaret's hand hovered near her mouth, eyes glassy. David scrolled frantically through his phone as if numbers could undo law. Linda shook her head again and again, whispering no like it was a shield. I closed the folder and rested both hands on it. The community you mocked will carry our family's name with gratitude. That is where grandfather's legacy belongs. Patricia slid the revised agreements across the table, her pen resting neatly on top. One by one. They hesitated before taking it, as though the ink itself carried shame. David scrawled his name quickly, jaw clenched, refusing to meet my eyes. Linda's hand shook so badly she had to steady the page with her other palm. Margaret signed slowly, pausing midway as though she might refuse, but the silence in the room pressed her forward. Richard was the last. He held the pen in his hand, his eyes fixed not on the paper but on the portrait above the mantel, my grandfather, stern yet steady in oil and canvas. For years, Richard had believed he carried that same authority. Now the painting seemed to look past him. To me, with a hollow exhale, he signed, the pen scratching the final surrender. Patricia gathered the papers, tucking them back into her case with efficient precision. These terms are effective immediately, she said. Her voice was neutral, but final. I let my gaze move across the room. The oak furniture, the gleaming shelves, the ancestral portraits all had borne witness to a shift no one could reverse. My family sat in silence, their lives suddenly smaller, their comforts contingent on rules they had mocked only hours earlier. Richard remained seated even as the others pushed back their chairs. He gripped the pen, staring at it as though it might still hold the power he had lost. The clock ticked on, unbothered, marking the moment with steady indifference. I rose from my chair, the scrape of wood against the floor startling in the silence. Their eyes followed me, wide, wounded, expectant as if I might undo everything with a single word. I gathered the folder, sliding the clasp shut, the sound neat and final. For a moment I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the room. David's defiance had drained into tight-lipped anger. Linda's mascara streaked faintly. Her phone clutched useless in her hand. Margaret sat stiff, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes darting between me and Richard as if searching for rescue. And Richard himself, my father, still held the pen, as though refusing to set it down might restore the power that had slipped away. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean closer, witnessing this fracture in a line they had presided over for generations. The air felt heavy with endings. I adjusted the strap of my bag, every motion deliberate. "Live within your means," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the table. "You taught me how." No one answered. The words settled in the room, sharp enough to hold without explanation. I turned toward the door and walked out, leaving their silence intact, leaving them to sit with the truth they had once tried to make me believe about myself. The days that followed unfolded quietly, yet the ripples were unmistakable. I heard about David first forced to cancel his lavish client dinners, replacing them with modest lunches that drew fewer handshakes. The confident luster in his voice dimmed, replaced by strained explanations. Linda began listing her designer wardrobe for consignment, the glossy veneer of her lifestyle thinning as she canceled a long-planned trip to Paris. The social circles she prized so dearly moved on without her, leaving her scrolling through photos of events she no longer attended. Margaret lingered in the house, pen in hand, writing a letter she rewrote 3 times. Whether apology or plea. I never knew she folded it into a drawer instead of sending it. Richard spent hours at the dining room table with a calculator. The same man who once scoffed at budgets now hunched over numbers like a student late to the lesson. And me, one morning, I stood outside a community center, ribbon in hand, the plaque newly fixed above the door, the Thompson Foundation. Children and families streamed inside, laughter filling the space. For the first time, the wealth that had divided us gave something whole back to the world.